Can you hear me? Am I audible? Yes. Um, okay, so both Professors Townsend and Autor consider transitions of finances and of the spatial access to finances and of the means of production in manufacturing and other kinds of technology, and both give us cause for optimism in the long term, that there'll be new jobs and increased welfare. And of course, welfare and inequality are separate issues, but in the long term, they are both pretty optimistic. But while they see large welfare gains as happening, they happen only eventually. And so mostly what I have in my discussion is questions. And for Professor Townsend, my question is going to be, what are the historical parallels from which we might learn about what to expect from things like internet availability of access to finance? And for Professor Autor, I'd like to hear more at some point, and I'll have some speculations about the transition. There are going to be lots of new jobs. 60% of the jobs he tells us about are new since 1940. But what happens to the people whose old jobs disappear? Not all of them are going to transition to pediatric vascular surgeons. So let's think a little bit about what might be some possibly illuminating transitions that we've gone through in the past. Okay, so when we think about the spatial access to finance that Professor Townsend talks about, maybe the big transition we've seen over the last more than a century on the spatial access to retail, to commerce, will have some lessons for us. I don't know what they are, but let me just think a bit about the transition we've seen in retail. And of course, now when we see Alibaba and Amazon, we're seeing a very modern part of that transition, but it starts very early. In the United States, in the 1800s, Sears, Roebuck, and Montgomery Ward invented mail order catalogs, and that allowed rural consumers all of a sudden to access all sorts of goods that were not available or were only available from monopoly general stores in their rural areas. So all of a sudden you could order clothing, for instance, by mail. And that changed the amount of household production of clothing that we did in the United States. And it changed women's work a lot. Production of clothing used to be a big part of the work of rural women. And in cities, there was a similar kind of transition. There was just yesterday, the October issue of AEJ Applied came out, and there's a paper by Professor Wei Yu, who's now at Peking University. It's called "The Economics of Speed: The Electrification of the Streetcar System and the Decline of Mom and Pop Stores in Boston from 1885 to 1905." So what Professor Yu is telling us about is that even in cities, there was some local monopoly power of local stores because it was hard to get to more distant stores. But when public transit became available, we saw a movement from small local stores to large downtown department stores. And of course, a later transition with the automobile, as it became common, was department stores were supplanted in many ways by suburban shopping malls where you could easily go and park. You could reach them without public transportation, and you could park your car and shop. And of course, those shopping malls are now being displaced in many respects by electronic commerce that's been accelerated during the COVID lockdowns. So we've seen big transition in spatial access to retail, and it's had good and bad effects. And the transition has sometimes seen the workers in smaller stores going to work maybe at less desirable jobs, like being warehouse workers for Amazon. But overall, the long-term aspects of the transition may come to resemble more what Professor Autor has told us about as new kinds of jobs get created. So let's think a little bit about other historical examples we have of big changes in production where new jobs have been created and we don't miss the old jobs, but where the transition was tough and that had impact on inequality. So think about the transition from agriculture to manufacturing. At 150 years ago, almost more than 40% of American workers were agriculture workers, and I think now that number is down to something like 2%. And we don't miss those jobs. To work outdoors in all weather is not so much fun. We prefer working indoors and air conditioning when it's hot out and a roof over our heads when it's raining. But the people who were displaced by the mechanization of agriculture didn't get those air-conditioned office jobs. Many of them became textile workers. They worked in sewing machines and looms in textile mills and in the East Coast, and they lived in tenements. They didn't live in the countryside anymore. It's not clear that their welfare was improved, although their grandchildren are doing much better in many ways and are more prosperous and live longer and are healthier than they were. And similarly, we saw a transition from manufacturing, heavy manufacturing in the United States. I lived in Pittsburgh in the 1980s, and the steel mills were closing up and down the Ohio River Valley. And if you were a middle-aged steel worker, you might never have gotten as good a job again. So having the mills closed was bad for you. But of course, if you were the high school student child of a steel worker, you didn't go into the mills at that point, and maybe you did become a pediatric vascular surgeon. So I think this is one of these things where we have good reason to be optimistic about the long term, but we can perhaps learn some lessons about managing the short term. So let me close on a subject not touched on by Professors Autor and Townsend that I'm interested in, which is health inequality and how it's affected by access to health in various ways. And think about access to COVID vaccines in the United States in particular. Now the main barriers to access are behavioral and political. But in the early days, they were often digital. That is, lots of people who wanted vaccines had trouble finding where they could get them and making appointments. And there were lots of stories of elderly people who had priority for vaccines, relying on their children and grandchildren to operate the web for them to make appointments. So removing spatial disparities doesn't necessarily give everyone equal access. There might be generational differences. And of course, the other big thing that's going on with digital access, and especially during the lockdown, is the growth of telehealth. And that has two different kinds of implications. One is for patients, and another is for doctors and how they do business. So I was very glad to hear about the doctor brides in Pakistan who are able to work better with telehealth, because similar transitions have taken place in American medicine. When I was young, it wasn't at all unusual for family physicians to make house calls, and if you were hospitalized, they would round in the morning at 6 a.m. to help wake you up and see if you were resting comfortably. But now, and that was a tough job for couples to have. For you didn't see in those days too many men and women married to each other who both had very active medical practices, because somebody had to be home to take the kids to school and to make breakfast and things like that. So medicine has transformed the job description of doctors. Now there are hospitalists. Your general practitioner, your primary care physician won't come to see you in the hospital necessarily, and there can be part-time work. There are practices that share patients in efficient ways. So it's changed. It's increased the ability of women to have high-powered medical careers. And I think telehealth, we're not quite in the situation of the doctor brides in Pakistan, but it's very likely that will continue and be improved with telehealth. It may also improve the healthcare to people in rural areas, just as the mail order catalogs improve their access to commerce. So, but there'll be transitions. There'll be kinds of medicine that it'll take a little while for us to learn how to deliver with telehealth, and some of those will have unequal outcomes for different populations of patients. So I'll stop there. Predicting the future is hard. Keynes in 1930 wrote the famous article, The Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren, in which he anticipated that 100 years in the future, so that's in the coming decade, that the basic problems of scarcity and supplying needs would have been solved, and one of our big problems would be how to handle all our leisure. That doesn't seem to have happened. I think much in the way that Professor Autor describes. We've found other things to do, and we still haven't, of course, increased food security for everyone in the world, and all of those things that Keynes thought might perhaps be solved by now. But looking ahead is always difficult. But both of our speakers in this session are looking ahead optimistically, and so I'm encouraged to hear that.